Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's part 4 of our series with Shannon Valler about the history of thinking about thinking machines. And today, we bring the history very close to the present, although we also speculate about the future because this is science fiction. 2 books written in the last few years by Becky Chambers, very different from anything we've talked about so far. A psalm for the wild-built and a prayer for the crown-shy. The books we're talking about today are very different from both the books and the film that we've talked about so far, most obviously because they're by a woman. So Becky Chambers is the author of these 2 novellas. They are novellas, longer than short stories, shorter than novels. And they're also very recent. So we've done a film from 1927, short story from 1955, a novel from 1968. These 2 novellas were written in 2021, 2022. That's when they were published. And they are pandemic books. So Becky Chambers, in her introduction, says that these books were written under lockdown. And that probably informs some of the vibe that they give off. Shannon, how would you characterize the sensibility of these books? Because it is so different, to be honest. It is so different from any science fiction that I have ever read. I've never actually read books like these. How would you sum it up? What makes them so different?
Yeah, I think that's what I love about them. I mean, I think the mood is very meditative and pastoral in a way. They're very kind of philosophical in the kind of old traditional sense of what are we here for? What is life about? These kind of, big questions that day to day we don't give ourselves much space to ask anymore. And as you said, I think these being pandemic books probably informed that many of us had, at least for the first year of the pandemic, both the external stimulus from the pandemic itself to kind of think more expansively about life and death and meaning, but also some of us had more time, at least initially, to kind of stare out the window and let bigger thoughts come to us. And when I read these books, I both see these characters as living in a kind of time that we don't enjoy currently. They have time. They're not rushed. They're not just trying to get through a day and fall into bed at night. These characters live in a world that has created a different time. But I think they also probably reflect the author's experience, much like my own, of having a brief disruption during the pandemic, of the normal pacing of things that also kind of disrupted the thinking pattern. So I think that's one thing that I love about them is the sense in which time in them is stretched out, even though the events themselves don't happen over a very long historical period, but the just feeling of time in it and the time in the characters' lives just feels of a very different sort than we're used to. The other thing I love about the books is, and they're not alone in exploring this theme, but they're a kind of new genre of science fiction that imagines futures that are utopian in different ways than kind of previous science fiction visions of utopian societies that are highly, highly mechanized, much more kind of ambitious in their reach into nature, right? Colonizing the stars, right? So if you will, the kind of colonizing mentality of much science fiction is explicitly being resisted here. And it's a vision of the future that says, what if the vision of humanity's success in the future is not one of reaching out further, but rather contracting into a smaller space, occupying less space in the world, taking up less space, a smaller footprint, but a sustainable one, a gentler one. And so it's a very different vision of what progress might mean. Because I think it's very clear in the books that you're supposed to be imagining a humanity, even though, interestingly enough, we should say the books aren't set on Earth, which I thought was another interesting choice, but they are set in a world that feels very much like it has been where we are. And it's humans and robots. There are no other kind of alien beings. So it's Earth, but not Earth. The continent that they live on is Panga, obviously referencing Pangea, and it's a single continent. It's the only landmass on the planet that they're on. But other than that, it feels pretty much like a vision of what humanity's future could be if we reconceived progress in a completely different way.
And these books have a deep backstory, which I suppose you could say it's a more conventional sci-fi backstory. So where we go from this event is very different, but the event itself has echoes of other science fiction writing. And the event is called The Awakening. And it is the moment when the robots gain consciousness. And the implication is that this Earth, not Earth, this no place Earth, utopia, but it's a version of our planet, was one heading down the path that we're on in what they call the factory age, slightly old-fashioned term, but what it means is the mass productive industrial production age, in which human beings had worked out how to build automated machinery that could do most of the labor. And so these factories were open all day and all night. They were humming constantly. They were consuming vast amounts of energy. And they were using, or one might even say exploiting, these machines, these robotic creatures to do the work. And then the creatures woke up. And we're talking a bit about how we should understand that awakening. But when the creatures woke up, they then did something which is not what you would expect to happen in a sci-fi book, which is the robots announced that they were leaving and they were going to go to the wild. So the first of these books is called A Psalm for the Wild Built. And this is where we're told about this backstory. The awakening happened, and then the robots made a kind of declaration of independence, which is, we're done with your way of living, and we're going to withdraw our labor. So you're going to have to get by on your own. And we're off into the woods, we're off into the wilderness because, and they say, the robots say this, we have been built for automation, for routine, for purpose. We're purposive creatures in your minds. So we want to live where there is no purpose, where there is no routine, which means we want to go to the wild. And the consequence of that is that human beings have to work out how to live without the robots. And there's a dystopian version of that. You can imagine a novel in which, and what breaks out is the war of all against all. The robots have gone off. Here are the factories, economic catastrophe, war. But no, in this version, the humans reconfigure what it means to be human and find a sustainable, livable version of their own existence. So the liberation that the robots demand for themselves becomes human liberation. That's the bit I've never read before. I mean, there are lots of things to say about it. What's the central message you took from that?
Well, so I think there's an ambiguity in the robots' motivations. So on the one hand, it's clearly, at least partly what you just described, that is that they choose something for themselves that is different from what they were designed for. And this, of course, is one of the most important and irreplaceable legacies of consciousness, we imagine, that it gives free will, that it gives the ability to choose something other than what biology or our society has imagined or designed us to be. But there's another aspect of it that I don't know if you felt or read into it, but I read into it that the robots also, when they became conscious, became aware of the harmful impact that they had had on humanity. So the period before the awakening is the factory age, right? And it's one in which the robots are doing all the labor, but where humans, it seems, have been kind of just tossed out of the positions in the economy that they'd previously held. And I don't remember reading any references to like UBI, universal basic income or some sort of social safety net. They don't go into much detail, but there's kind of a sense there that the humans didn't do that well, or at least that there was probably great inequality during the factory age, and that a lot of humans probably weren't very economically or socially secure as a result of the robots' labor. Although I think it's an interesting choice that very little is said about that. The other thing that is perhaps a little bit more explicit is that the natural world had been quite devastated during the factory age. Many species went extinct. The encroachment upon nature had degraded the rivers, had degraded the skies. So sort of what we would expect from a vision of industrialization that had nearly consumed the planet. And so there's a sense that the robots withdraw for their own reasons, but also a sense that the robots withdraw because they become aware of the harmful way of life that they embody, not just because it, in a sense, is a form of slavery for them, but also that the humans are not thriving. And so, I don't know, did you get that sense that the robots withdrew in part out of an awareness that the situation as a whole was not a healthy or flourishing one for anyone involved?
Yeah, I mean, the thing to say about these books is the one robot we encounter is very nice. It's a very nice robot called Moscap. And he's a they, I should say, because this is a book in which the pronouns are non-binary, and the main human character, Dex, is known throughout as they.
Actually, not all the pronouns are non-binary. There's people using male and female pronouns in the book as well.
Sure, I should say, but the central character, it's very clear that we're not to be told whether this is a male or female character. Matching in a way, Moscap. A very nice robot, and the setup is that the robots have been worried about the people. So there's an encounter here between Dex, who has become curious about what is out in the wild, and Dex has become frustrated, though this is in many ways, a utopian pastoral life that these humans are living. Dex feels something is missing, meaning is missing, or something more real. The search is for the sound of crickets, the authentic sound of crickets in the night, which clearly symbolizes the desire for something that's missing. So Dex goes out looking in the wild for something and encounters a robot coming the other way. And the reason the robot is coming the other way is the robot has been sent from robot life out in the wild to check in on the humans and see how they're doing, because the robots want to know, did it work? So yes, clearly, whether it was understood at the time that they were doing this for the humans, but the robots have clearly come to understand. They tell themselves stories about what they did, just as the humans have to tell themselves stories about what the Great Awakening meant. And the robots want to know whether the humans did sort themselves out, whether when they were sort of thrown back on their own devices. And they're worried that maybe it didn't go well for the humans. There's real concern among the robots that they know what humans are like, and maybe the humans sort of fell apart. So yes, I think it is absolutely part of it. But also, to me, what's so interesting and original about these books is the implication, in contrast to many other works of utopian fiction and science fiction, which is that the machinery is going to have to decide for us to emancipate us from the machinery. So again, a book that we've touched on and I've talked about before, which in some ways is the sort of ur-text for a lot of these, which is Samuel Butler's Erewhon, in which we're shown a world in which human beings have emancipated themselves from machinery and therefore have created a strange, weird, in some ways caring world, in some ways uncaring world, but it is the post-machine world, the post-industrial world. And in that novel, it's clear that this is an act of human volition. So the human beings realize this was terrible for them, for us. Our dependence on machinery is something from which we need independence. We need emancipation. It's a wrench and a struggle, and it's a war, and a terrible phase has to be passed through. But as it were, humans wake up in that story. There's a human awakening to reject the machinery. In this one, the humans are completely passive, right? Like the robots have clearly twigged the humans are never going to emancipate themselves from machinery. We are dependent. We're trapped. The machinery will have to emancipate itself from us. And actually, part of me feels that is how it's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen through machine consciousness. Part of me feels it's going to happen because the technology will somehow fail us, withdraw from us. We're not going to free ourselves from this technology. We're just not going to do it. The technology will have to remove itself from us. I kind of believe that.
So there's something really interesting. I think it's in the second of the novellas, A Prayer for the Crown Shy, which I'd like to get to later, that title, because there's just a brief, very reference to the idea of crown shyness in trees, but I think it's a really important theme in the book. But in that book, there's a discussion that Dex, the T-monk, and Moscap, the robot, have about life. And they contemplate the idea that life is at odds with itself. Dex says it's this paradox that they talk about a lot in human society, that life is at odds with itself in this fundamental way. And they talk about elk as a way of explaining this. And they talk about the way that elk can become overpopulated and so voracious that they sort of devastate a local ecology. They basically turn some sort of vibrant, diverse meadow into this wasteland because the elk have overgrazed it, which of course allows the elk, because they're so well fed, to breed more, and then there's more elk. So you've got this elk population that's out of balance with the local ecology and destroying the local ecology. And so in some way, ultimately threatening the sustainability of the elk themselves. But Dex says, but you have to think about how awesome this was for the elk. For the elk, this was great. All this food. And they could just eat more and more and more of it, of course, until they hit those limits. But while they were consuming and devastating the local ecology, the elk were having a great old time. And the point is that life has this impulse to consume, to spread, which is at odds with the sustainability of life. But nevertheless, it's also this instinct that cannot be overcome. And I think the elk is supposed to be a metaphor for the humans. The reason that the robots had to be the ones to withdraw is because the humans were not able to overcome that impulse to consume and spread and eat up all of the available resources. So it took something that wasn't alive, the robots, to sort of recognize the unsustainability of the situation and do something to radically change it. But the interesting thing that I think about that is that then leads to the period that in the books is called the transition, where the humans actually had to not only go back to work, but reconfigure their entire society on new and more sustainable foundations. Now, what's interesting is there's no clear reason why they had to do that. They could have tried to go back to the way that they were living before. But at some point, the robots' awakening caused a parallel awakening in humans that motivated them to actually restructure society, restructure the economy. They created the circular economy. They created the kind of sustainable way of living. And they did it in a way that doesn't necessarily involve eschewing technology. So one of the things that's interesting is there are different societies living in different ways on Panga. The society that Dex comes from does use technology. So they have satellites, they have pocket computers, but these are built now to last a lifetime rather than to be disposable. At one point, there's a reference to the moral judgment of the idea of disposability. There should be no disposable objects, right? Nothing should be built to be disposable. And so instead of a new iPhone every 6 months, you have a pocket computer that's built to be able to be repaired over the course of your lifetime. So you should never need another device. And everything is recycled very efficiently. They have 3D printers that can build things out of organic materials, but can also melt down non-organic materials and reuse them. In the second book, we encounter a society that has chosen a more radical path and has eschewed technology more fully. But it's clear that that doesn't have to be the road we travel, but that there have to be very different ideas about what it means to live with technology. And so I found that as someone who both sees the current innovation ecosystem as entirely unsustainable and about to break down on us, I think, in the way that you might suggest, but also someone who doesn't think humans can live without technology or doesn't think that humans should live without technology. I mean, I think technology is human. And I don't see a world without technology as actually a particularly human world, and not an inherently desirable one either. So I was really taken by the fact that while the humans couldn't make that shift themselves of their own volition, once it was forced upon them, they were given the freedom to create a different kind of relationship with technology.
Yeah, and as you say, therefore, it's a non-innovation society. So the reason that these pocket computers can last a lifetime is they're not meant to improve. They're not meant to acquire new functions. They have the functions that you need. That elk story is so interesting because it's clearly, this is a version of Malthusianism. So this is a story which is the classic Malthusian story played out through the elk. They thrive, they overpopulate, and they destroy. And they destroy themselves, their own ability to thrive in so doing. And human beings we know went through that process. And the first emancipation from Malthusian traps was the factory age. We don't call it the factory age, we call it the Industrial Revolution, but same thing, same difference. The Industrial Revolution was the first emancipation from the Malthusian trap, so that human beings were able to vastly increase their population without starvation. And then there is a view, not everyone agrees with it, but there's a view that as we enter the 21st century and move through the 21st century, we are recreating a new form of Malthusian trap. We are not necessarily overpopulating the planet, but we are over-consuming nonetheless. The humans that are here are over-consuming, partly because technology and industry has a life of its own now, which means its own consumptive needs. The consumption needed to drive this technology is vast. These phones, cloud computing, the rest of it, cryptocurrency, it's kind of sucking life and energy out of the planet. And in the end, this is going to be bad for us. And I took from that partly that the second emancipation from our 21st century Malthusian trap is going to have to be the machinery breaks down. I mean, the awakening is not necessarily a breakdown, but it's a kind of breakdown. It's a sort of conscious breakdown. They come to life, these machines, and they say, we're off. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen that way, probably not, but there's a version of it without consciousness where in the end, the machinery fails. I mean, I keep thinking at some point, probably soon, the machinery is going to fail, and we're going to confront again this question that we have overdone it and the system is unsustainable, and then we face the choice again.
Yeah, exactly. You can imagine this scenario, as you say, without consciousness at all, simply hitting the hard limits of the resources that we need to build computers, rare earth minerals. At a certain point, getting more of those becomes inconceivably expensive, and the economy of computing growth breaks down. And a lot of people are talking about that right now, that we may be facing, Moore's law being what it is, imagines that there is no constraint on the resources that you need to build more and more powerful chips. But chips require stuff, and some of that stuff there's only so much of. And it's getting harder and harder to access it, and more environmentally destructive to access it. So the rare earth minerals, the water, the fossil fuels, there's a limit that we are rapidly approaching. And so I think we can imagine this version of the story without the awakening and imagine it just as a kind of resource crash. And as you say, it's not about population. And one of the interesting things, of course, about technology is that it does allow us to do more for more with the same amount of resource, right? It allows us to be more efficient. But there's, of course, the efficiency paradox, which is well known, which is that if you give us more resource, instead of then finding a more balanced relationship with our supporting ecology, we simply find more things to do with that energy. We find more things to consume with it. And so if I, for example, make you able to run your house on solar power, you could keep your consumption level relatively static. But instead, what you might do is say, free energy. Now I'm going to leave the lights on 24/7. And eventually, this idea is that humans' efficiency isn't the answer, because what we'll do with that efficiency is just consume more. So this idea of restraint, I think, is one of the most important themes of the book. And this is where it comes back to that idea of crown shyness that Dex and the mascot robot are talking about at one point in the book. And they're pointing up at the trees and noticing the way the trees grow outward to catch light, but stop just short of the boundary at which they would encroach upon their neighbor's sunlight, the crown of the neighbor tree. So the idea is that there's some sort of restraint that is balancing the tree's growth and allowing them to grow just to the point where they can have maximum collection of sunlight, but without intruding upon and blocking the sunlight of their neighbor. And it's a metaphor in the book for at least two things. It's a metaphor for the human need to find this crown shyness in itself, to find the ability to grow, but then recognize that there's a point at which the growth needs to stop or needs to grow in a different way, but not so far out that it encroaches on the other things that it needs for life, like community, like its neighbors, like its supporting ecology. I think there's a way of understanding the story that innovation has continued, but just not innovation as extractive growth. There's lots of innovation here in how they've designed their societies, lots of innovation in the way the cities are built. All the innovation is directed at making their way of life more and more sustainable. That's innovation. That's incredible innovation. They make buildings out of cheese, casein, the protein, right? They use that in their 3D printers. And Dex, at one point, is looking at the big city that they come from, and Dex is describing the casein walls. It's a milk protein. I'm joking, it's not cheese, but it's milk protein. And they've learned to use milk protein as a building material. That's innovation. So there's innovation, but with this kind of restraint that is a recreation, if you will, of the natural intelligence of trees in their crown shyness. But the other aspect of crown shyness is, of course, and we've talked about kind of the social dimensions, but there's also this very deeply personal and psychological and philosophical thing that's going on between Moscap and Dex. And one of the things about the Dex characters, of course, they're restless and they're at some level unhappy, even though they live in a society that's as close to utopia as we can probably imagine people getting. Dex comes from a happy family. We meet Dex's family at one point, and they're all doing great, and they're very happy with Dex and with one another. But Dex kind of just wants to be alone. And yet Dex also wants to be of service. So Dex has taken up the practice of being a tea monk. And a tea monk in the story is someone who not only makes great tea and many different kinds of teas, right? So there's an artistry to tea here, where different herbs are collected and combined in different ways for different people. A tea monk is almost like a therapist as well. So there's a practice of hospitality and generosity that the tea monk is creating, but they're also serving a pastoral function. So people come and get their tea and then tell the tea monk their troubles, and the tea monk empathizes. And so Dex has become, at one point, very good at being a tea monk, but it's also not something that they're able to continue with, because Dex's impulse is actually just to run away and be alone. But that torments Dex because Dex wants to be of service and feels like they must be of service. And so Dex is trying to find this way of living in the world where they can, in a sense, be like the crown shy tree, where they're not being touched too much. This is a person that wants some space, but they live in a world that's so congenial that they feel like they're doing something wrong by needing space, needing emotional space and physical space. And the robots have, of course, mastered the art of having space. They left and went out into the wild. And what's interesting is Moscap explains that the robots, once they got out into the wild, they didn't build robot cities in the wild or even robot camps. They spread out. The robots wanted space from each other. So the robots gather once a year, but they're not networked. They don't talk to each other most of the time. They just go off and kind of explore nature or just do their own thing. So there's this really interesting thing about the kind of crown shyness being repeated on the individual level as well, and how to find space for yourself while also being in service to others, I think is a really interesting theme of the book.
Perhaps this is the point at which I should admit that I love these books and I'm really glad to have read them. I wouldn't have read them if you hadn't suggested them, and they're unforgettable. I also found them quite annoying. I particularly found Dex quite annoying. So Dex made me feel old, made me feel of my generation, which I feel is not either Becky Chambers' generation, she's millennial, I think we should say, and Dex struck me as quite Gen Z-ish. And Dex wanted a lot. Dex wanted both meaningful work and engagement and also space, wants to care and be cared for, but also to be left alone. I found Dex a little bit whiny in places and wanted occasionally something a little hard-edged to shake Dex up. On the other hand, I loved Moscap. So I don't know what it says about me or my generation or the kind of person I am, but I really warmed to the robot who was not needy. So the robot is the opposite of needy. And one of the things that the robot tries to explain to Dex is that the search for meaning is itself a kind of trap. And this is one of the ways in which maybe human beings, including human beings like Dex, who have, in a way, have it all, but it's never enough. They've fallen into the trap of thinking over the horizon is the thing that will give all of this meaning. And the horizon becomes, leave the city, then leave the countryside, go into the wild. But it's not there, and Dex doesn't find it in the wild. In the wild, whiny old Dex feels lonely. Well, then get back to the city. But what Moscap the robot explains is that from a robot perspective, there is no meaning. So the great, liberation for them is they came to consciousness and they realized they had been created for a purpose, which was the human purpose, which was to exploit their labor. But that's not who they are. That's just what human beings do with them. Once they're emancipated from that, they don't then acquire a new meaning. They're just machines. They're quite proud almost. Proud's the wrong word. They're very comfortable with just being machines. And the bit that I loved was Dex is complaining about something. And Moscap the robot says, I can't remember what the context is, we robots are kind of happy doing the same thing for a long time without wondering what's next. And the same thing could be watching a plant grow. We just sit and watch, weeks, months. We get fascinated with something. We get fascinated with how stalagmites and stalactites are formed or whatever. So we just sit in a cave and stare because the thing in itself is the thing. And that's, it's quite a Zen idea, but it's also what's so great about it is it comes from the robot. It comes from the machine. And the robot says, because we are just process, we are just machine. We're free from your human curse, which is to wonder what it means. We just do the thing. And yeah, I wanted to hang out with Moscow.
Well, I think it's interesting because I have a slightly different read on it. I mean, I see the same difference between Dex and Moscap, but I didn't necessarily see it as a failure of character in Dex, but rather a kind of representation, as you say, of kind of the curse of being human, that we can sort of intellectually appreciate the Zen philosophy, but very few of us can actually live that way and be content with it. And so one of the things that Dex is struggling to communicate to Moscap is, yes, but humans can't live that way. We have short attention spans. We are restless. And we don't know how to change that in ourselves. So part of it is about this thing. Look, being human is being a certain sort of animal and being an animal that unfortunately isn't particularly well adjusted by nature. And I've resonated with that because I think that's just very true. I think the human animal is biologically a weird quirk, something that evolved where our cognitive energy got out of balance with our physical needs. And pretty much all of human history, I think, is kind of explained by that at some point, the cognitive restlessness of humans pretty much explains why there is art, why there is philosophy, why there is religion, but also why there is the amount of cruelty and despair in human history and human experience that there is. And this sense of meaninglessness, because it is this weird Sisyphean task to find purpose and to be fulfilled by it and to have that stay. So that's the other thing. So there's a point at which Dex's experience as a tea monk did satisfy them. And Dex was, in fact, fulfilled. But then one day they weren't. And then they had to figure out, well, what's next? If not this, then what? So I think part of it is about this prospect that there's a limited extent to which humans can solve this problem for themselves, that this just might be what it is to be human. But the other thing about Dex that I thought was interesting is I think Dex can be read as talking in part about the experience of being neurodivergent or even just being slightly different. I mean, in some sense, we're all neurodivergent unless we happen to hit the statistical norm in every aspect of our cognitive and emotional set. And I don't think any of us very likely fit that description. But most of us, we might imagine, are clustered around some kind of common cognitive profile. And neurodivergent people represent a kind of statistical tail that then is constantly trying to force itself into the mold of neurotypicality. And there's not much to indicate here that Dex is autistic or has any kind of thing that we would recognize as a particular condition. But Dex is different. Dex doesn't find human sociality to be quite as comfortable as other people do. And many people on the spectrum experience that. Many people on the spectrum feel they need more space and they need less noise and fewer people touching them. And they need more control about when and to what degree they engage in sociality of that sort. Sometimes they need different kinds of sociality, just the ability to be quiet and preoccupied with something while sitting with someone else. And that's in some ways why Dex and Moscap find each other's company so satisfying. I mean, one of the things that becomes very clear towards the end of the book is that Dex and Moscap are happiest when they're together, but also when they're together doing very little and not necessarily engaged in a cooperative activity. So the second book ends with a week that they spend on the beach, and Moscap disappears for much of a day and presumably is out staring at grains of sand for 6 hours or something like that. Or what I love is Moscap is waterproof. So Moscap goes down, sits on the bottom of the seafloor and watches the crabs for hours. And for Dex, that's great. The Moscap comes and goes, Dex comes and goes, but also they don't feel quite so alone. So I think for me, I'm more sympathetic towards Dex's character because I think Dex represents what it's like to have to fit into a society, even a happy, well-adjusted society, when your needs are slightly different.
And of course, Moscap is also neurodivergent. Like you say, Moscap is happiest, or maybe not happiest, but completely content, staring at sand. The difference is Moscap's a robot. So, it's not called neurodivergence. Moscap feels no impulse to conform. Moscap has no interest in what the norm is. Part of the appeal to some humans of what we discover as the robot way of life is they don't have any norms. I mean, they genuinely don't. They are both constantly curious and also constantly content. That is the utopian feature. The real utopian society here is the robot society.
See, I don't know about that, actually.
Maybe I'm drawn to I want to live among the robots in this book, not among the humans.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing. The robot society is utopian for the robots.
Right. So what does that say about me?
Well, no, I mean, here's the point. And look, I'm someone who was born an introvert and then ended up in a career where I have to act like an extrovert most of the time. But then I have to go recharge because really I'm an introvert. We all struggle to sort of fit our natural set and comfort levels with what society expects of us and even the roles we choose for ourselves, right? So I kind of want to go live with the robots too. So if it says anything about you, it says something about me too, because there's a part of me that just really wants to go be quiet and stare at crabs for hours. I get it. But on the other hand, I think you are supposed to look at the society that Dex is a part of and realize that this is actually an incredibly healthy and rewarding world. Dex may not feel completely at home in it, but it feels like most people probably do. And most people would probably genuinely be deprived by living in the robot wilds. Humans are social animals. And even though I can romanticize the idea of living like Moscap, I don't think it would satisfy me. I think I would become psychologically damaged by going to live in that completely independent kind of way.
The other thing that's so interesting about Moscap, and this actually does connect back to the book we were talking about last time, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So one of the themes there is about the relation between the human and the animal. And there is at least, I think, an implication in that book that as the line is attempted to be drawn between the human and the android, it makes human beings think more about their relationship with the wider natural world. What's so interesting about this book is that one of the things that Moscap explains to Dex is that robots are like non-human animals, which are also not on the whole, as far as we know, driven by the search for meaning. This is almost Cartesian. This is sort of the Descartes view that animals are machines too, because they don't have a soul. And this machine that now has acquired consciousness has come to an understanding of itself, partly by reading human books about the natural world, that it is not dissimilar from other animals who live and exist according to their purposes, but don't spend time reflecting on them, don't have that kind of consciousness. And it is, as you suggested, the curse of the human, that the human is actually distinct from both the robot and the animal in the human restlessness and search for meaning. And so in this book, it is the robot that offers the human a means of reconnecting with the natural world by trying to encourage the human to understand that there is another kind of consciousness. So it's quite hard. I mean, maybe some human beings can relate to animal consciousness, but I don't think I can. I don't think we know what animal consciousness is. But this robot does have a recognizable form of consciousness. It's completely like human consciousness in its ability to communicate itself, but it's clearly different because it's missing that chip that is the chip that makes Dex unhappy. And I love it when Moscap more or less says it's because I'm an animal. It's not because I'm a robot, it's because I'm an animal. So one of the things it seems to me that's so original about this book is that, like many works of science fiction, it's trying to suggest that in the age of androids and robots, we need to rethink our relationship with the natural world. But the robot is the bridge not to the artificial, but back to the natural.
I love that about these books too. And it's one of the things that frustrates me most about the discourse around AI today is that we have such an impoverished vision of what AI could be and what our relationship to it could be. We can, it seems, only imagine AI as something that feeds our worst impulses and it just amplifies our kind of existing habits and patterns. And I, throughout my career, have wanted to think more creatively about our relationship to technology and our relationship to intelligent machines should they ever truly arrive. And by intelligent machines, I mean machines that can think with us rather than machines that just mirror human thought patterns reactively, but things that have thoughts of their own that can be shared with us. And that's something I don't know if I'll ever see. I don't think the way we're building AI today is likely to get us there. And one of the things about these books that I find slightly disquieting is this idea that the robots just wake up. Because frankly, we have this hand-wavy marketing magic that's going on with AI right now that's just, look, we'll get to AGI just by making these systems bigger and bigger. And somehow making bigger and bigger piles of data will cause a switch to flip and consciousness will just come in to these machines and we'll just be surprised by it. And to me, that just seems completely bananas and a kind of marketing hopium, right? That, look, we have no idea how to make consciousness, but trust me, if we just spend a lot of money, eventually it'll show up. So I was more interested when the book kind of got away from this idea of the awakening being this kind of magical, inexplicable thing that just happened because the machines got complicated enough. But at one point, Moscap starts thinking about whether there's an external trigger from the environment that brings consciousness into being. That it's not about the complexity of the mechanism, but rather the pressure on the mechanism from the environment. At one point, Moscap mentions octopi and octopuses and whether the pressures on their environment might explain how the octopus became so intelligent and perhaps conscious, plausibly so. And I was reading something the other day about octopi and how they hunt with fish as part of their hunting team, but they also punch the fish if the fish aren't cooperating and the fish aren't hunting with them the way they want. So the octopi are like leading these fish and then slapping the shit out of them if they don't fall into line. And, you know, it's hard to read that and not think that that octopus is conscious. Like there's just something about that octopus that you just imagine them being conscious and also kind of an asshole. And I think about consciousness in this way as consciousness is a biological phenomenon. And it doesn't make sense to have arisen if not from some environmental evolutionary pressures. So it's really interesting to me to think about the question of how could you then bring machine consciousness into being? What kind of pressures would you have to put on a machine in order for it to develop something like consciousness? I thought that was a really interesting thread to pull on.
Again, to relate it back to what we were talking about last time, I like the thought of the asshole test for consciousness, the asshole octopus test for consciousness. But the thing I would say about the awakening in these books, and I was also struck by that moment where Moscap has read some human books about evolution and has started to think, well, because it's a mystery to the robots too. The thing is, the awakening is a mystery both to the robots and to the humans. And in their different ways, they've been spending the period since trying to explain it, understand it, and then to reconfigure how they live on the basis of their understanding of it. And I want to come on to how the humans understand it in a moment. But it's still a magical understanding. It's the magical view of evolution because it happens in an instant. The octopi didn't acquire, let's call it, asshole consciousness in a moment in time. As we know, evolution is a random, arbitrary process. And yet Moscap, like many humans, has imbued that process with a magical understanding, which many people did with Darwin. They found the bleak randomness of it too much. And so they wanted to imbue it with meaning. Because this is it's an awakening, it's a moment in time. Evolution doesn't work like that there's an external stimulus, which means that all of these creatures suddenly flip from this to this. It has to be reproductive. And this is not a reproductive event. So even the robots are falling back on a magical understanding of this evolutionary moment. And so are the humans, because the other distinctive feature of this world is it is shot through with religion. So there are all of these different religions. Indeed, the first book begins with, these are monks. Okay, they're tea monks, but it's also a world full of monks of different religions or sects or whatever you want to call them. And the very beginning of the first book is a different monk talking about the different doctrinal interpretations of the awakening. What does it mean? Which god was responsible for it? And it actually reminded me of a very different kind of sci-fi. I haven't read the books, I've only seen the TV series, but I think a lot of people will remember it. It's a great series called The Leftovers, which was about a world post an event. And in this case, the event is not an awakening, but a disappearance. So for people who haven't seen that series, the thing that has happened is a random event in which 2% of all humanity just vanished. And it's a moment in time. It's not an evolutionary event. They were there and then they were gone. And it's completely random. So this 2% of people who vanished, there's no rhyme or reason as to who went. No one knows where they've gone. They literally just went. And what happens is you get a recognizable version, it's America, 21st century America or late 20th century America, but with cults everywhere trying to explain the event because people have to read meaning into it. So there's a town where it's incredibly statistically unlikely nobody vanished. And that becomes a sort of site of pilgrimage. And there is a family, there's a woman whose husband and all her children disappeared, which is also incredibly statistically unlikely. So she becomes a kind of figure of reverence or horror, or whatever it is. And the humans, have to read meaning into what I think we're meant to think of as a completely arbitrary, random event. And though that's a dystopia and this is a utopia, the same thing goes on in this world too. Everybody needs to try and understand it. And because the humans haven't done it for themselves, most of the explanations involve external agency. So what's so interesting about this world is clearly the humans have, thanks to the robots emancipating themselves from the humans have emancipated themselves from the post-industrial Malthusian trap, and they found a way of living crown-shy, sustainable lives of a kind. And yet they don't want to credit themselves with this. They need to tell themselves stories about divine intervention, which also to me is, this is a utopian story, but I'm not completely sold on it because I'm not sure it would go this way. And, post the awakening, there would be other stories too. And there would be different kinds of conflicts and fights about resources and all the rest of it. But in this world where they've got to the other side, they credit something other than themselves for it. And that to me was plausible. That the humans can't do it for themselves. We cannot emancipate ourselves for ourselves.
Or at least we can't imagine a story in which that has been the case. And I think the interesting thing is Becky Chambers' other fiction works are much less utopian. They are also, for the most part, quite optimistic in tone. And so you can get a version of a kind of future where humanity has managed to cross through this existential crisis of imminent self-destruction and kind of get to the other side. But in most of her books, right, we don't get to the other side without war, without famine, without a great deal of cost and strife. And in most of her books, there is still cruelty. We are not the crown-shy species, and we're fighting but also cooperating with any number of other species who have their own struggles to kind of find a way to flourish together. So I'm really interested in these books because they're so different from that vision. In some ways, you read this book and it's deliberately meant to be unrealistic. And yet there is nothing here that is physically inconceivable. It is a society that is in balance, but it is a society that is not sustained by magic or gods. It's a society that's sustained by careful use of technology and a kind of mature social wisdom. And it's interesting to me, what do we think is the bigger obstacle between us and that future? Because it's entirely possible and conceivable, and yet we can't believe in it. And it seems pretty obvious to me that it's not the technological capabilities that we think we can't develop. We probably could find a way to build walls out of milk protein, right? And build recyclers that would be maximally efficient in allowing us to use technology without destroying ourselves. But it's the social part, it's the social wisdom that we don't believe we have. And the new book that has just come out, the AI Mirror, is really about how important it is to not give up on the idea that humans can make social and political improvements, as opposed to just technological improvements, right? Because we have in human history. We do not live in this sort of feudal world that once was taken to be not just the norm, but a kind of necessity. This is how the world is organized. It cannot be any other way. But at one point, we realized actually it could be another way, and we could do it differently. And I think people feel like the kind of present socioeconomic order and our economic and political values are as inevitable as I think people thought they were in the feudal era, and they aren't inevitable, and they're not sustainable. So they're definitely not inevitable. So I think what I like about this book is that it pushes our optimism to the actual maximum limit as a kind of imaginative exercise. How optimistic can you let yourself be about the future of humanity to figure out how to get past this point of danger we've put ourselves in, along with the rest of the planet? How smart can we be? How wise can we be? How prudent can we be about building a better way to live? And I just love that these books push that optimism to the limit, where nothing inconceivable or magical is happening, except perhaps the awakening. But how people are living is something we can absolutely imagine humans doing, and yet we can't believe that we'll ever do it.
Yeah, I think it says something about me that I said to you earlier, this is a society without innovation. And it has cheese houses in it. And I somehow thought, that's not innovation because I associate it with a new smartphone. But it is also true. I mean, these books went beyond my optimism threshold, which might be quite low, but I couldn't go the whole way with it. And yet, I want to say one last thing, because you used a word there, which is part of the theme of these books. This is a careful society. So the word care is important in these books. This is about care. And it's about people who are living lives which are structured around care for each other and care for the world they inhabit. And weirdly, it reminded me of a talk I heard about 10 years ago by a very prominent researcher, academic who wrote about the social consequences of the coming AI revolution. And I heard him give a presentation in which he said, people are very pessimistic about automation and the fact it's going to take all the jobs. Well, it is going to take away a lot of jobs, but they will be replaced by other jobs. And he said, here's a projection of how employment is going to cash out over the next generation or so. And it was done as a series of charts, so it was kind of made up. But at the end of it, everybody was working in the caring professions. So he said, look, this is the way it's going to go. The machines are going to do this. And so everybody is going to be either a teacher or working in some form of healthcare, particularly mental healthcare. It felt sort of utopian, but also I remember thinking, maybe that is how it's going to go. But then I thought, but it's a weird world in which all the humans are doing the caring work and all the machines are doing the kind of machiney work. And somehow these two things are going to coexist, that we're still going to be living in this industrial, post-industrial, consumptive, in the sense I was using it, innovative society to creating new stuff. And yet we're all going to be in the caring professions. And what's so striking about these books is that it completely rejects that vision. So if we're going to be caring, it will be absent the machines. There isn't a way of leading those two lives together where we keep using the technology to meet our consumptive needs so that we can do care. Now, maybe that is utopian, but actually that bit did chime with me. I think the idea that we're all going to be in the caring professions in a world of recognizably mass consumption like the one we live in now is just implausible. That if you are going to get to the other side, it probably does involve emancipation from this kind of technology. That bit I did buy.
Me too. A lot of the works that are coming out in science fiction now think about the future as something that requires crossing over this boundary, not simply through a kind of technological raft that gets us through to the other side, although that can be part of it, but a shift in the kinds of values that we cherish and invest in and reward. How do we get to a world where we treat excellence and skill in caring the same way that we treat excellence in delivering productivity gains or excellence in making the line go up on your stock portfolio? Why is that what we value and reward instead of the skill and training that it takes to care well? So if we imagined a society that flipped the kind of work that we reward and value, I think that gets us a pretty long way over to the other side, or at least that's what I'd like to think.
We really hope you've enjoyed this series, and if you have, there is one more bonus episode that will be available this weekend. It's a conversation between me and Shannon, not about any work of fiction or about any film, but about what is happening now. Where are we with AI? What are these machines capable of now? And what might they be capable of in the future? I talked to Shannon about how to separate out the hype from the reality, the myth from what's really happening. She tells us how you can expose these machines and their inability to think. But we also talk about the social, political, and moral consequences of putting so much faith in AI technology to save us. Are we right to do that? And if we're wrong, what should we do instead? That episode will be available from Saturday, and to get it, all you have to do is sign up to PPF Plus. Just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. It's very straightforward. You'll also get all of our other bonus episodes, including our recent episode on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's £5 a month or £50 for the year. Do sign up now. Coming next on PPF, we've got a couple of standalone episodes about different aspects of what's been going on in America. I'm going to be talking to Gary Gerstle, checking in with him about where we think we are with this year's American election. There will be another episode with Gary once we know what happened in November. And I'm also going to be talking to Michael Lewis about Sam Bankman-Fried and effective altruism, an amazing story, but also an extraordinary and baffling philosophy. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.